The lunch tray slipped from my hands, clattering against the cafeteria floor as I stared across Lincoln Elementary's crowded lunchroom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. There, sitting at table 12, was my daughter Emma. But that was impossible, because Emma was also sitting at table 7, wearing a completely different outfit, lapping with different friends. And somehow, impossibly, there was a third version of her at table 15, with the same dark curls, the same crooked smile, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. 3 identical 8-year-olds who shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet were right there in front of me, eating their Tuesday pizza like the universe hadn't just turned inside out. Jonathan Mitchell had been the maintenance supervisor at Lincoln Elementary for 6 years, long enough to know every crack in the hallway tiles and every child's face in the building. His daughter Emma was in 3rd grade, which meant he got to see her during lunch breaks when his schedule allowed. It was one of the few perks of a job that mostly involved fixing broken radiators and mopping up various unidentifiable substances that 8-year-olds seemed to produce with alarming frequency. That Tuesday started like any other. Jonathan wheeled his supply cart through the main corridor, past the colorful bulletin boards showcasing student artwork, and the trophy case that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. The morning had been routine. A clogged toilet in the boys' bathroom, a flickering fluorescent light in classroom 204, and the ongoing battle with the heating system that had been temperamental since the school was built in 1987. He'd raised Emma alone since she was 2 months old, when her mother, Sarah, had died in a car accident that still haunted his dreams 6 years later. The hospital social worker had placed the tiny, fragile baby girl in his arms, and Jonathan had made a silent promise that he would be everything she needed: mother, father, protector, and provider. It hadn't been easy working double shifts as a maintenance worker to afford their small 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside, but Emma was worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt about whether he was doing enough. Emma was his miracle, his reason for getting up every morning, his proof that love could overcome any obstacle. She had Sarah's dark curls and bright smile, but her stubborn streak was pure Jonathan Mitchell. She was brilliant in math, terrible at keeping her room clean, and had an uncanny ability to find stray animals that somehow always needed rescuing. Their Friday night tradition of pizza and old movies had been the highlight of his week for as long as he could remember. The cafeteria duty wasn't technically part of his job description, but Jonathan had volunteered to help supervise lunch periods after a budget cut eliminated one of the aide positions. It gave him a chance to see Emma during the school day, to make sure she was eating her vegetables and not trading her apple slices for cookies like he suspected she'd been doing since October. He pushed through the double doors into the lunchroom's organized chaos, scanning the familiar sea of small faces for Emma's table. She usually sat with her best friend Maya near the windows, close to where the sunlight streamed through and highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny ballerinas. Jonathan spotted Maya immediately, her distinctive red braids making her easy to find in any crowd. But Maya was sitting with a girl who looked exactly like Emma, but wasn't Emma. Jonathan blinked hard, wondering if the morning's chemical cleaning fumes had affected his vision. The girl had Emma's face, Emma's hair, Emma's exact build and mannerisms. She was even wearing the same purple sneakers that Emma had begged for at the shoe store last month. Then he saw another one. And another. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 identical girls, scattered across different tables, eating lunch with different groups of friends, completely unaware that they were genetic mirrors of each other. Jonathan's legs felt weak as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. Triplets. His Emma had sisters, identical sisters who were attending the same school, living in the same city, breathing the same air, and he'd had no idea they existed. The lunch tray fell from his numb fingers, the sound echoing through the cafeteria like a gunshot in the sudden silence of his comprehension. Jonathan's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old Honda Civic, parked across the street from Sterling Industries' gleaming downtown headquarters. 3 hours had passed since the cafeteria incident. 3 hours of pacing his apartment, calling in sick to work, and trying to process what he'd witnessed. The school records office had been surprisingly helpful once he'd explained his concerns about potential student mix-ups. Emma Mitchell, Sophie Chen, and Lucas Rodriguez were all 8 years old, all born on March 15th at Chicago General Hospital, all adopted through different agencies. The coincidence was impossible to ignore, yet the implications were too overwhelming to fully comprehend. Jonathan had spent the afternoon making phone calls, starting with Emma's pediatrician and working backward through every document he'd kept from her infancy. The adoption paperwork told a story he'd never questioned before today. Sarah's pregnancy had been difficult, complicated by preeclampsia that had required hospitalization during her final month. She'd given birth prematurely at 34 weeks, and the baby had spent 6 weeks in the neonatal intensive care unit, while Sarah fought for her life in a medically induced coma. Jonathan remembered those weeks as the darkest of his existence, shuttling between Sarah's ICU room and the NICU, where his daughter lay, connected to monitors and feeding tubes, so small and fragile that he'd been afraid to touch her. The nurses had been kind but overworked, and he'd barely slept during those endless days of uncertainty. When Sarah died from complications related to her pregnancy, Jonathan had been too devastated to question anything about the adoption process. The social worker had handled all the paperwork while he grieved and learned how to care for a premature infant who required round-the-clock attention. Now, staring up at the 40-story tower that housed one of Chicago's most successful technology companies, Jonathan wondered how many other details he'd missed during those traumatic weeks. The online research he'd conducted that afternoon had yielded surprising information about Rebecca Sterling, the 34-year-old CEO whose company specialized in educational software development. She'd built Sterling Industries from a small startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, earning recognition as one of Chicago's most innovative young entrepreneurs. But what caught Jonathan's attention wasn't her business success. It was the brief mention in a Forbes interview about her charitable work with hospital foundations, specifically her support for neonatal intensive care units. Rebecca Sterling had been born at Chicago General Hospital, according to the biographical information he'd found online. She'd also given birth to twins at the same hospital 8 years ago, though the article mentioned that one of the children had died shortly after birth. Jonathan pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photographs he'd discreetly taken in the cafeteria using his maintenance supervisor privileges. Emma's face stared back at him, but so did Sophie's and Lucas's. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was genetically identical. The shape of their eyes, the curve of their smile, even the way they held their heads when concentrating on their lunch. These weren't just similar-looking children, they were siblings. And if Jonathan's growing suspicions were correct, they were triplets who had been separated at birth through a hospital error that had never been discovered or corrected. The thought made him physically ill. Emma had sisters she'd never known about, a biological family that had been scattered across the city by administrative incompetence or a deliberate cover-up. Jonathan had spent 8 years raising one child, while somewhere in Chicago, Rebecca Sterling had been raising 2 others, both of them believing they were twins who had lost their triplet sibling at birth. Jonathan's phone rang, startling him from his increasingly dark thoughts. Emma's school was calling to remind parents about the upcoming spring carnival, a cheerful automated message that seemed to mock the chaos currently consuming his life. He'd promised Emma they would attend together, just like they did every year. She always entered the art contest and never won, but she approached each year's submission with the unwavering optimism that made Jonathan's heart ache with pride and protectiveness. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that her entire life story might be built on a mistake? That the father who'd raised her alone, who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped with homework and bandaged scraped knees, might not be her biological parent? That somewhere in this city were two children who shared her DNA and a woman who might have the legal right to claim her? The Sterling Industries building cast long shadows across the street as the sun began to set behind Chicago's skyline. Jonathan had driven here without a clear plan, operating on instinct and desperation rather than logic. What was he supposed to do? March into the lobby and demand to speak with Rebecca Sterling about a hospital mix-up that occurred 8 years ago? Present his theory about switched babies to a successful CEO who probably wouldn't give him 5 minutes of her time? But as Jonathan sat in his car, watching well-dressed business professionals exit the building and head toward expensive cars in the parking garage, he realized that his options were limited and time was running out. Every day that passed was another day Emma spent unaware of her true identity. Another day her biological siblings grew up without knowing she existed. The longer he waited, the more complicated the situation would become for everyone involved. Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Patterson, his downstairs neighbor who watched Emma after school when his work schedule required it. Emma was asking when he'd be home, wondering if they could have pancakes for dinner, because it was Tuesday, and Tuesdays deserved something special. The normalcy of the message highlighted how dramatically his world had shifted in the span of a single afternoon, while Emma's remained the same. He thought about Sarah, about the promises he'd made to her memory and the vows he'd taken to protect her daughter from any harm. But what if protecting Emma meant confronting the truth about her origins? What if the greatest disservice he could do to her would be maintaining a lie that denied her the chance to know her biological family? The marble floors of Sterling Industries' executive lobby echoed with each step Jonathan took toward the reception desk, his work boots feeling clunky and inappropriate against the polished stone. He'd spent the entire night rehearsing what he would say, practicing different versions of an impossible conversation while Emma slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that her father was planning to potentially upend both their lives. The receptionist, an impeccably dressed woman with silver hair and the kind of professional smile that suggested she'd been screening unwanted visitors for decades, looked up from her computer with polite skepticism. Her nameplate read Margaret Thornton, and her expression shifted from courteous to concerned as she took in Jonathan's appearance. Clean work clothes, nervous energy, and the unmistakable look of someone who didn't belong in corporate surroundings. "I need to speak with Rebecca Sterling," Jonathan said, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. "It's about her children. It's urgent." Margaret's fingers paused over her keyboard, and Jonathan could see her mentally categorizing him as either a threat or a nuisance. "Miss Sterling doesn't take unscheduled appointments, sir. If you'd like to leave a message or schedule something through proper channels, I can connect you with her assistant's office." Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to the photographs he'd taken in the school cafeteria. His hands were shaking slightly as he turned the screen toward Margaret, showing her the image of 3 identical children who should have been impossible. "These are her children," he said quietly. "All 3 of them. And one of them has been living with me for 8 years because somebody at Chicago General Hospital made a mistake that nobody ever caught." The change in Margaret's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her professional composure faltered as she stared at the screen, her eyes widening with recognition and something that looked like fear. She glanced around the lobby as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned forward and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Stay right here," she said, reaching for her phone. "Don't move, don't talk to anyone, and don't show that photograph to anybody else in this building." The next 20 minutes felt like hours as Jonathan stood in the corner of the lobby, watching business executives come and go while Margaret engaged in a series of hushed phone conversations. She could see her gesturing emphatically, occasionally glancing in his direction with expressions that ranged from confusion to alarm. Other staff members began to take notice, whispering amongst themselves and casting curious looks at the maintenance worker who was causing such a disturbance in their usually orderly environment. Finally, Margaret approached him with the kind of carefully controlled demeanor that suggested she'd been given very specific instructions about how to handle this situation. "Miss Sterling will see you now," she said, her voice tight with tension. "37th floor. The elevator will take you directly to her office." The ride up 37 floors gave Jonathan entirely too much time to second-guess his decision. Through the glass walls of the elevator, he could see Chicago stretching out below him, a city that suddenly felt much smaller now that he knew Emma's siblings were somewhere down there, attending school and living their lives completely unaware of each other's existence. The higher he climbed, the more removed he felt from the world he understood, ascending into a realm of wealth and power where decisions were made that affected thousands of people's lives. Rebecca Sterling's office occupied the entire corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views in 3 directions. Jonathan had expected someone intimidating, a corporate executive who would immediately establish dominance and control over their conversation. Instead, he found a woman who looked exhausted, vulnerable, and significantly younger than her business photographs suggested. She was standing behind an enormous mahogany desk, her hands pressed flat against its surface as if she needed the support to remain upright. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that might have been elegant that morning, but now looked disheveled, and her expensive suit couldn't disguise the fact that she appeared to have been crying recently. "Show me the photograph," she said, without preamble, her voice hoarse with emotion. Jonathan approached the desk slowly, placing his phone on its polished surface and stepping back to give her space. Rebecca Sterling picked up the device with hands that trembled visibly, her face going white as she studied the image of 3 identical children who should have been impossible. "My God," she whispered, sinking into her chair. "Sophie and Lucas, and—" She looked up at Jonathan with eyes that reflected the same shock and confusion he'd been experiencing since yesterday. "Who is the 3rd child? Where has she been living?" "Her name is Emma," Jonathan said quietly. "Emma Mitchell. I've been raising her since her mother died when she was 2 months old. I thought she was my daughter. I thought Sarah was her biological mother. The adoption paperwork never mentioned anything about multiple births or siblings." Rebecca set down the phone and stared at him with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing horror. "That's impossible. I gave birth to triplets at Chicago General Hospital 8 years ago. One of them died shortly after birth. The doctor showed me. They said—" Her voice trailed off as the implications began to register. "They made a mistake," Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the words he'd been rehearsing all night. "Somehow, some way, the hospital mixed up the babies. You were told that one of your children died, and I was told that Emma was the biological mother of a woman who died from pregnancy complications. We've both been living a lie for 8 years." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of revelations that neither of them had been prepared to face. Rebecca stood up abruptly and walked to the windows, staring out at the city, while Jonathan remained motionless beside her desk, unsure if he should continue speaking or wait for her to process what he'd told her. "I visit their graves," she said, suddenly, her voice barely audible. "Every month for 8 years I've brought flowers to a cemetery plot where I thought my 3rd child was buried. I've cried over an empty grave while my daughter was across town, living with a stranger, growing up without knowing she had siblings." I felt my chest tighten with empathy for this woman whose pain was as profound as my confusion. "I'm not a stranger," he said gently.
I've loved Emma every day of her life. I've read her bedtime stories and helped with homework and bandaged scraped knees and taught her how to ride a bicycle. She's not just biologically related to me. She's my daughter in every way that matters. Rebecca turned from the window, and Jonathan could see that she was crying now, tears streaming down her face despite her obvious attempts to maintain professional composure. "I don't know what this means," she said. "I don't know what we're supposed to do with this information. How do we explain to 3 children that their entire understanding of their family has been built on a hospital error? How do we undo 8 years of separation and trauma?" The questions hung in the air between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Jonathan realized that confronting Rebecca Sterling had only been the first step in a process that would require decisions and sacrifices from both of them. Choices that would affect not only their own lives, but the futures of 3 innocent children who had no voice in what happened next. "I don't know either," he admitted. "But I know that Emma deserves to know the truth about who she is."
And Sophie and Lucas deserve to know that their sister didn't die. They deserve to know each other. Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that made her seem less like a powerful CEO and more like a mother who was trying to navigate an impossible situation. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully before answering. "I want what's best for Emma, and I think what's best for Emma is knowing her siblings and understanding where she comes from. But I also want her to know that the man who raised her isn't going anywhere, that this discovery doesn't erase the family we've built together." The conversation that followed would determine the course of 4 lives, and Jonathan could feel the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders as he prepared to negotiate the most important agreement of his life. The Lincoln Elementary Spring Carnival was in full swing when everything fell apart. Jonathan stood behind the ring toss booth, watching Emma bounce from game to game with the infectious enthusiasm that made other parents smile and comment on what a delightful child she was. The past 2 weeks had been a carefully orchestrated dance of normalcy, while he and Rebecca Sterling worked through lawyers and genetic testing and family court mediators to determine the best way forward. They'd agreed to keep the children in the dark until all the legal and medical confirmations were complete, until they had a plan that would minimize trauma and confusion. The DNA results had arrived that morning, and Jonathan's phone had been buzzing with messages from Rebecca's attorney all day. 3 matches. Biological siblings. The scientific proof of what they'd already known in their hearts. Jonathan watched Sophie Chen spinning at the carousel while her adoptive parents, a kind-looking couple in their 40s, cheered and took photographs. Across the playground, Lucas Rodriguez was attempting to knock down milk bottles with a softball, his adoptive mother offering encouragement while his father recorded everything on his phone. 3 children, 3 families, all of them blissfully unaware that a legal storm was brewing that would reshape their understanding of family forever. Emma ran up to him with cotton candy stuck to her fingers and a huge grin on her face. "Dad, look what I won!" She held up a small stuffed elephant that probably cost the school 50 cents to purchase. "Can we play the duck pond game next, please?" Jonathan knelt down to her level, studying the face he'd known since birth, the features that were identical to 2 other children playing just a few yards away. "Em, there's something important we need to talk about. Something that might be confusing at first, but I need you to trust me, okay?" Emma's expression shifted from excitement to concern, her 8-year-old instincts picking up on the gravity in his tone. "Are you sick? Is something wrong with Mrs. Patterson? Did I do something bad at school?" "No, sweetheart, nothing like that." Jonathan glanced around the carnival, suddenly aware that this conversation was happening in the most public possible setting, surrounded by families and children and the cheerful chaos of a school fundraiser.
Do you remember how we've talked about how some families look different from other families? How some kids live with grandparents or have two moms or two dads? Emma nodded solemnly, her attention completely focused on him now. Like how Tommy has two houses because his mom and dad don't live together anymore. Right, exactly like that. Well, sometimes families are more complicated than we first understand. Sometimes there are people who are part of our family that we don't know about until we're older. Jonathan could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. Em, I need to tell you something about your family that's going to sound really strange at first. Before he could continue, Emma's gaze shifted to something behind him, and her eyes widened with an expression Jonathan had never seen before. Not confusion or fear, but recognition. Pure, startling recognition. Dad, why are there two more of me here? Jonathan turned around to see Sophie and Lucas standing 10 feet away, both of them having broken away from their respective families to stare at Emma with the same expression of shocked recognition. The carnival continued around them, parents chatting and children playing, but the three children stood frozen in a bubble of silence and understanding that seemed to exclude everyone else. Sophie spoke first, her voice barely audible over the carnival noise. "You look exactly like me." Lucas stepped closer, his head tilted in the same characteristic way that Emma did when she was trying to solve a puzzle. Like we're the same person, but we're not, are we? Emma looked back at Jonathan with accusation and hurt beginning to cloud her features. Dad, why didn't you tell me I had a sister and brother? Why didn't you tell me about them? The questions hit Jonathan like physical blows, each one representing a betrayal of trust that he'd never intended to commit. Around them, other carnival attendees were beginning to notice the remarkable resemblance between the three children, whispers and pointing starting to create a circle of attention that made Jonathan feel exposed and vulnerable. "I didn't know," he said desperately, kneeling down so he could address all three children at once. "I swear to you, Emma, I had no idea they existed until last week. If I had known, I would have told you immediately." Sophie's adoptive parents had noticed their daughter's absence and were approaching with concern written across their faces. Lucas's family wasn't far behind, drawn by the commotion and his son's unusual behavior. Jonathan realized that the careful plan he and Rebecca had constructed was crumbling around them, destroyed by the simple power of three children recognizing each other despite 8 years of separation. "Are we related?" Lucas asked, his question directed at all three adults who were now converging on the scene. "Are we like cousins or something? Or twins?" Sophie added, though her mathematical skills were already telling her that 3 identical children couldn't be twins. Emma looked back at Jonathan with the kind of trust that he'd spent 8 years earning and that he was about to shatter with a single sentence. "Dad, are they my brother and sister?" The crowd around them was growing larger. Other parents and school staff drawn by the unprecedented sight of 3 identical children standing together in what was clearly a moment of profound significance. Rebecca Sterling appeared at the edge of the crowd, having just arrived to witness the confrontation she had hoped to avoid. She was dressed casually for the first time since Jonathan had met her, wearing jeans and a simple sweater that made her look more like any other concerned parent than a powerful CEO. Her face was pale as she took in the scene, 3 children processing the truth about their relationship, while dozens of strangers watched and recorded every moment. "Mom," Sophie looked between Emma and Rebecca with confusion. "Mom, why does this girl look exactly like me? Why didn't you tell me I had a sister?" The question carried across the carnival grounds with startling clarity, causing even more heads to turn in their direction. Jonathan realized that they'd reached the point of no return.
that any hope of managing this revelation privately and carefully had been destroyed by the children's own instinctive recognition of their shared identity. Emma reached out tentatively and touched Sophie's hand, and both girls gasped as if they'd received an electric shock. "You're real," Emma whispered. "I thought I was dreaming you." Lucas moved closer to both his sisters, and suddenly all three children were hugging each other with an intensity that spoke to 8 years of unconscious longing for something they'd never been able to name. The crowd around them fell silent, witnessing something that was clearly sacred and private despite its public setting. Jonathan felt tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter embrace the sibling she'd never known existed, and he realized that no amount of legal planning or careful preparation could have made this moment any less profound or overwhelming. The children had taken control of their own story, forcing the adults around them to confront truths that everyone had been trying to manage and contain. The carnival continued around them, but for Jonathan, Rebecca, and 6 parents who were about to have their lives forever changed, the world had shifted on its axis. 3 children had found each other despite 8 years of separation, and now everyone involved would have to figure out how to build a future that honored both the families they'd known and the biological connections they'd just discovered. 6 months after the carnival revelation that changed everything, Jonathan stood in the kitchen of his new house in Oak Park, watching 3 8-year-olds argue over pancake toppings with the casual intensity that only siblings could achieve. Emma insisted that blueberries were superior. Sophie advocated for chocolate chips, and Lucas maintained that plain pancakes with syrup were the only civilized choice. The debate had been raging for 10 minutes, and Jonathan found himself smiling at the beautiful normalcy of it all. The house was a compromise between his modest means and Rebecca's desire to provide the best possible environment for the children's adjustment period. She'd quietly purchased the 4-bedroom colonial and arranged for Jonathan to make affordable monthly payments that wouldn't strain his maintenance supervisor's salary while ensuring that all 3 children could have their own spaces when they needed them. The legal arrangements had been complex, but ultimately successful. Rebecca maintained primary custody of Sophie and Lucas during the school week, while Jonathan had Emma Sunday through Wednesday. Weekends were shared time when all 3 children stayed together, alternating between Rebecca's renovated Lakeview townhouse and Jonathan's new suburban home. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and more importantly, it kept the children together while honoring the bonds they'd formed with their respective adoptive families. Emma had adapted to the arrangement with remarkable resilience, though she'd insisted on keeping her last name Mitchell and maintaining their Friday night movie traditions even when her siblings were present. Sophie had initially struggled with divided loyalties between her biological siblings and her adoptive parents, the Chen family, who'd welcomed the expanded family structure with grace and understanding. Lucas had thrown himself into the role of protective big brother with enthusiasm, despite being only 17 minutes older than his sisters according to their original birth records. "Dad, tell Sophie that chocolate chips aren't a breakfast food," Emma called from the kitchen table, where she was setting out plates with the methodical precision she'd inherited from Jonathan's practical nature. "Sophie, chocolate chips aren't technically a breakfast food," Jonathan replied dutifully, earning a triumphant grin from Emma and an eye roll from Sophie that was pure Rebecca Sterling. "But Lucas gets syrup, which is basically liquid sugar," Sophie protested, demonstrating the logical reasoning skills that made her formidable in family negotiations. Jonathan flipped the pancakes and marveled at how quickly this chaos had become normal, even comforting. The first few months had been emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Family therapy sessions, legal meetings, awkward dinners where 3 children tried to figure out how to be siblings while 2 adults navigated the complex dynamics of shared parenting without being romantically involved. Rebecca arrived precisely at 9 o'clock as she did every Saturday morning, carrying coffee for Jonathan and small gifts for the children that were thoughtful without being excessive. She'd learned to balance her instinct to solve problems with money against Jonathan's insistence that the children understand the value of simple pleasures and modest expectations. "Morning, everyone," she said, accepting enthusiastic hugs from all 3 children while Jonathan poured the batter into perfect circles on the griddle. "Who's ready for the museum?" The Chicago Children's Museum had become their regular Saturday destination,
a neutral territory where all three children could explore and learn together while the adults figured out how to co-parent across vastly different backgrounds and life experiences. Rebecca had initially suggested more elaborate outings, Broadway shows, expensive theme parks, weekend trips to educational destinations, but Jonathan had convinced her that the children needed consistency more than extravagance. "I want to see the dinosaur exhibit again," Lucas announced, bouncing in his chair with excitement. "We saw it last week," Sophie pointed out. "Can we do the science experiments instead?" Emma, ever the diplomat, suggested they could do both if they managed their time wisely, a proposal that earned approving nods from both adults who were still amazed by their daughter's natural mediation skills. As they prepared to leave for their museum adventure, Jonathan caught Rebecca's eye across the kitchen chaos. 6 months ago, they were strangers thrown together by impossible circumstances, forced to trust each other with their most precious relationships. Now they'd developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the children's well-being. The investigation into the hospital error revealed a systematic problem with record-keeping during the period when all three children were born. Chicago General had settled quietly out of court, establishing trust funds for each child's future education while implementing new protocols to prevent similar mistakes. Jonathan didn't want the money initially, but Rebecca had convinced him that Emma deserved the same opportunities as her siblings regardless of their family's financial circumstances. At the museum, Jonathan watched the three children race through exhibits with boundless energy, marveling at how naturally they'd fallen into sibling dynamics despite 8 years of separation. Emma had become the group's conscience, always ensuring that everyone was included and happy. Sophie approached every challenge with strategic thinking that would serve her well in whatever career she eventually chose. Lucas protected his sisters with gentle determination, positioning himself between them and any perceived threats with instinctive gallantry. "They're remarkable together," Rebecca said quietly, standing beside Jonathan as they observed the children building elaborate structures in the engineering exhibit. "They were always meant to find each other," Jonathan replied, and for the first time since this journey began, he felt completely at peace with how everything had unfolded. The afternoon ended with ice cream and tired children who fell asleep in the car during the drive home, their hands still sticky from their treats and their faces peaceful with the contentment that came from a day spent exactly where they belonged. Jonathan carried Emma to her room while Rebecca settled Sophie and Lucas in the guest rooms that had become their weekend homes.
Spaces. As they stood in the hallway between the children's rooms, listening to the quiet breathing of three siblings finally sleeping under the same roof, Jonathan realized that they had accomplished something extraordinary. They'd taken a situation that could have destroyed multiple families and transformed it into something that made everyone involved stronger and more complete. "Thank you," Rebecca said softly, her words carrying the weight of 6 months of gratitude and respect. "Thank you," Jonathan replied, understanding that they were thanking each other not just for cooperation and compromise, but for the courage to put their children's needs above their own fears and uncertainties. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more complex negotiations as the children grew older and their needs evolved. But tonight, three siblings who'd spent 8 years unconsciously searching for each other were finally home, surrounded by adults who'd learned that love multiplies rather than divides when it's shared generously and without conditions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.